Isn't it unbelievable that there is a big uproar on the left, and in fact, from some huge corporations, over Georgia's law that establishes requirements for voter integrity? It's being portrayed as voter suppression. It's making it harder for people to vote. And let's think about this. I mean, interestingly enough, in American elections, the prospect of dead people voting, no uproar over that. The prospect of people who are out of state casting a vote nevertheless, no uproar over that. The prospect over people using illicit social security numbers, other people's numbers to vote, no uproar about that. The prospect of sending in dubious mail-in ballots that later have to be cured by calling the voter and adding an address or changing what was written on the ballot, no uproar over that. But on the simple matter that you have to show an ID to vote, big uproar. Voter ID has suddenly become, quote, controversial. And just the imbalance of this, the insanity of it, is the first thing we have to take note of. Now, let's look for a moment at Georgia's law, because while it's being portrayed as a revival of Jim Crow, I mean, let's remember, first of all, what Jim Crow was. Here's Jim Crow. You don't get to vote at all. Or you have to pay a poll tax. Or you are prevented from standing in line along with the white guy standing next to you. Or, to pursue Jim Crow further, you can't stay at the same hotel as that white guy. You have your own hotel. You can't eat at the same restaurant. You can get your hair cut by a white barber. You've got to go to a black barber. So this is Jim Crow. Does this bear any resemblance to what's going on in Georgia? Not at all. Here's what Georgia said. They've established a voting system that is actually far more favorable in terms of ease of access than many Democratic states. 15 mostly Democratic states are more restrictive on absentee ballots than Georgia. Let's take Connecticut. Let's take Biden's home state of Delaware. They have no early voting at all. New Jersey has a driver's license requirement, or you have to provide the last 4 digits of your social security number, even for online voter registration. Virginia requires both a photo ID card and your social security number. California also has ID requirements to register. Now, Georgia is establishing a registration requirement. It requires voters to provide the number and birth date on their state-issued photo ID card. But if you don't have a voter ID card, you can get one for free. So this is Georgia. It is actually a sensible, moderate, non-intrusive reform bill that Georgia put in place, evidently because of the belief that things were not conducted in the ideal or even the proper manner the last time around. And yet we now see, and this is a remarkable sight, we see these corporate leaders, both the CEO of Delta Airlines and the chief officer of Coke, both based, by the way, in Georgia. Now, these people have been heavily lobbied by the left. And so here is Ed Bastian, this CEO of Delta. I'm quoting him on the Georgia law. I need to make it crystal clear that the final bill is unacceptable. The entire rationale for this bill was based on a lie, that there was widespread voter fraud in Georgia in the 2020 elections. This is simply not true. First of all, how would he know? How would he know? Here you've got the CEO of Delta Airlines sitting in his office talking about airline schedules, presumably dealing with the problems that airlines are facing under COVID. He is pontificating there was no fraud. Now, it is one thing to say that the Trump people were not able to prove the fraud. They didn't have a forum to do it. The courts rejected on standing grounds or procedural grounds, or you should have made your case earlier. It is entirely different to say that there is no fraud. It's kind of like the difference between me saying there's life on other planets. I believe there's life on other planets. You say, hey, Dinesh, that's not proven. There's no substantial evidence that there's life on other planets. And I go, yeah, that's true. But it doesn't follow from that that there's no life on other planets. There very well could be. It very well could be that the evidence will come forth. It doesn't logically follow from there's no evidence for something that something does not exist. And yet here you have an airline guy declaring with certitude that that's simply not true. Of course, he's just echoing what he's read. So he's pretending to be in a position to know. In fact, he doesn't know. And here is, by the way, the CEO of Coca-Cola, James Quincy, talking about the Georgia law. Listen.
This legislation is unacceptable. It is a step backwards, and it does not promote principles we have stood for in Georgia around broad access to voting, around voter convenience, about ensuring election integrity. And this is frankly just a step backwards.
I'm actually laughing at the guy because you got a British guy. Now, first of all, this very same guy and Delta itself, Coca-Cola itself, Delta and Coca-Cola were involved in the process of this reform. Delta even said early on that they approved of the steps that Georgia was taking in order to sort of clean up the process. And now you got this British guy. I mean, first of all, it's hard for me to believe he's even all that sincere. I mean, I would really like to hear what he said to his wife when the cameras were off. He probably goes, "My dear, this is so ridiculous, the stuff I've got to tell these Americans with a straight face. It's absurd." So I have a feeling that you've got a guy who says one thing, he plays all the right violin notes, but then the moment the cameras are off, that's when we get to hear what he really thinks. Now, these people aren't dumb. And not to mention of the fact that they know all about ID requirements. And you know why? Because they use them. Delta requires ID to fly. I can't get on a Delta plane. I'm a brown-skinned guy. I can't get on without an ID. Does it follow that Delta is trying to discourage blacks and persons of color from flying? If requiring an ID to vote is voter suppression, is Delta engaging in travel suppression? I mean, if I show up at Delta and they won't let me get on, should I say, "You racist pigs! Why are you asking for my ID? Let me on board." Or I go to the doctor. "Let me through. Why should I turn off my ID? It's bigoted to ask me to do it." Or I will go to buy alcohol. "I refuse to show my ID. Give me the whiskey. Let me in." I mean, this is madness. If requiring an ID to vote is voter suppression, then is requiring an ID to buy an AK or to buy a gun Second Amendment suppression? Think about it. If you're making it difficult in any way to do something, and it follows that you are suppressing that thing, then our constitutional rights are being suppressed anytime there is any ID requirement whatsoever to buy a firearm. And when I come back, I'm going to talk in a little more detail about the absurdity of the case against voters.